The people closest to me called me a failure. But when I walked into my sister's custody battle, her own lawyer leaned over and whispered in shock, "Wait, you're the FBI agent on this case?" In that moment, everything changed, and so did the outcome of the trial. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I will never forget the way my mother's words sank into me like cold steel. "You've always been the one who didn't quite make it, didn't you?" she murmured one evening, her eyes sliding toward my sister's soon-to-be ex-husband as if he were the golden child she wished she had raised instead of me. It wasn't the first time I'd heard it, of course. For years, my family had labeled me the odd one out, the underachiever, the one who settled for a quiet life while everyone else married well, chased money, or found ways to look impressive at holiday dinners. But that night, those words stung more than usual, because they weren't just careless. They were ammunition, handed straight to the man who had spent months trying to tear my sister apart. My sister, Anna, sat at the edge of the table, eyes lowered, fingers knotted around her napkin as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the earth. Across from her, her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, lounged with an arrogance I had come to know too well. Every movement of his was deliberate, designed to showcase control. The way he leaned back in his chair, the casual smirk on his face, the expensive watch he let glint under the chandelier. It was all theater. He wanted us to see him as untouchable, and my family fell for it. They whispered about how successful he was, how he could provide for Anna's daughter, how Anna should have thought twice before leaving him. Not one of them seemed to care about the bruises left on her confidence, or the financial games he played to keep her dependent. To them, money spoke louder than character. I bit down on my tongue, forcing myself to remain silent. Years of experience had taught me that my role in the family wasn't to argue. It was to endure, to sit quietly while the spotlight turned to brighter stars. While others shone with achievements my family deemed worthy, they didn't know about my work. They couldn't know. For my safety, and for the safety of those I protected, my career remained cloaked in silence. But inside, I burned. That night, as laughter rose around the table and my brother-in-law leaned in close to whisper to Anna, his voice low, sharp, promising she would lose everything in court, I felt a chill climb my spine. My sister's shoulders slumped. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I saw in that moment a woman who had been cornered, pushed past the edge, and abandoned by those who should have stood with her. And I knew something inside me had shifted. My family's words, failure, disappointment, "You'll never measure up," circled in my head like vultures. They thought I was powerless. They thought he was untouchable. But what none of them realized, not even Anna, was that I had been preparing for men like him my entire career. I didn't say anything then. Not yet. I simply placed a hand over my sister's trembling fingers, squeezed gently, and met her eyes. For the first time that evening, her gaze steadied. She knew I was there. She didn't know how much I could do, or how far I was willing to go. But in that quiet, unspoken moment, we both understood. I would not let him destroy her. I didn't care if my family saw me as a failure. I didn't care if he thought his money made him invincible. What I cared about was justice. And justice, though patient, always finds its way to the truth. Justice, though patient, always finds its way to the truth. I knew that better than anyone, because in my world, truth wasn't just a concept. It was a weapon. But before I explain how everything unraveled, you need to understand the world I was living in at the time. On the surface, I looked like the plain one in the family. I didn't boast about promotions. I didn't flaunt expensive cars or wear jewelry that announced my worth. I lived quietly, content with a modest house and a life that, to outsiders, seemed unremarkable. That was the image my family clung to, because they never looked deeper. The truth? My days were spent combing through the darkest corners of fraud, white-collar crime, and manipulation. I was an FBI agent, trained to see what others overlooked. A line of numbers that didn't add up. A document with a subtle inconsistency. A story rehearsed just a little too well. My work required silence, confidentiality, and most importantly, invisibility. I couldn't tell my family, not because I didn't want to, but because the safety of investigations and the lives they touched depended on secrecy. So to them, I was simply the quiet one, the failure. And then there was Anna, my sister. If I was steady and deliberate, Anna was light and warmth. She had always been the one who dreamed big, who wore her heart openly, who trusted easily. It was that very trust that had led her into the arms of the man who would later try to destroy her. She believed in his charm, his promises, the life he painted in vivid colors when they first met. But charm has a way of souring when the mask slips. And by the time she realized who he truly was, she was already bound to him by marriage and a child. Her daughter, my niece, became the bright spot in an otherwise suffocating marriage. Anna's love for her little girl was the reason she found the courage to walk away. But leaving didn't free her. It only gave him another weapon to wield. And oh, how he wielded it. My brother-in-law was everything my family admired. Wealthy, polished, a man with connections in the right places. He spoke with confidence, carried himself with arrogance, and had a knack for twisting conversations so that he always came out on top. To outsiders, he was successful. To me, he was a predator who had simply chosen a more socially acceptable hunting ground. What made him dangerous wasn't just his money. It was his ability to make others believe his version of events. He could lie with such smooth conviction that even the most skeptical person would hesitate to doubt him. My parents were easy prey for that. They saw his expensive suits, his legal team, his promises that Anna would never measure up to him, and they nodded along. That was the part that stung most. Not his arrogance, but my family's complicity. Instead of rallying behind Anna, they questioned her. They said things like, "Maybe he can give the child a better life." Or, "Are you sure you can handle raising her on your own?" Their faith shifted to the one with money, as if love and safety could be bought. For years, I had stayed on the sidelines, biting back the urge to reveal who I really was, what I really did. But at that time, my role in the family was fixed in their eyes, the one who never quite achieved enough. And that made what happened next so much sweeter, because he underestimated me, just as my family always had. What none of them knew was that I had been watching, quietly, carefully. I had seen the way he maneuvered conversations, how he spoke over Anna in front of the judge, how he smirked as his lawyers spread lies. He thought the game was his to win, but he didn't realize he was playing on a field I knew better than he ever could at that moment. Though my life with Anna and the family existed in an uneasy balance, she was struggling, my parents were dismissive, and I kept my head down. That was the normal world before the line was crossed, and that line was coming faster than any of us realized. The line didn't announce itself. It wasn't a thunderclap or a sudden explosion. Instead, it crept forward in subtle, calculated moments. The smirk in his voice, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes, the way my parents nodded along as if his words carried more weight than my sister's feelings. It was during one of those rare family gatherings, one meant to be cheerful, with the clinking of glasses and the aroma of roasted meat filling the house, that the reality of what I was facing finally hit. He leaned toward Anna, speaking low enough that the rest of us could only catch fragments of his threats. "You'll lose in court. I'll make sure of it. You'll never see your daughter without a judge's order." Anna froze, her hands clutching the edge of the table, knuckles white. The flicker of fear in her eyes was unmistakable, the kind that comes when someone realizes the person meant to protect them might not be able to. "And my family?" They laughed lightly at what they thought was merely dramatic exaggeration. They whispered among themselves about how successful he was, how much better he could provide for Anna's daughter. The betrayal stung sharply, but it was his next words that made something inside me snap. "And don't think your family will do anything for you," he said, a malicious edge cutting through the air. "They all know who's really capable. You're nothing compared to me." The knot in my stomach tightened. My heart raced not with fear, but with a cold, hard determination. I had spent years being the quiet one, the failure in their eyes. I had been underestimated by my own family, by everyone around me. But I wasn't powerless. I wasn't naive. And I certainly wasn't going to let him trample over Anna and her daughter. That night, after the family had left and the house had grown quiet, I sat with Anna in the kitchen. She didn't speak at first, just held her daughter's hand as if holding on tightly could shield her from the world. I could see the weight of fear and despair pressing down on her shoulders, and I realized that if I didn't act, she would lose more than a trial. She would lose her hope, her sense of security, her belief in fairness itself. For the first time, I revealed to her a piece of my life I had kept hidden. The work I did, the skills I had developed, the knowledge I had gained through years of investigating people like her soon-to-be ex-husband. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but enough to make her sit up straighter, to let a flicker of trust return to her eyes. That was the moment the line was crossed, not by one dramatic act, but by a series of deliberate, cruel choices that left Anna cornered, vulnerable, and betrayed. He wasn't just trying to win a custody battle. He was trying to assert dominance, to humiliate her, and to make a statement that the rest of us were powerless. And in that moment, I realized that my role in this story could no longer be passive. I had to act. I spent the night reviewing everything I knew about him, his finances, and the subtle ways he manipulated appearances. I replayed conversations, noted inconsistencies, and felt that familiar, sharp clarity I had learned to trust in my career. This wasn't just about winning a custody battle anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of deceit, protecting someone I loved, and reclaiming the dignity that my family had always denied me. The line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. From that night forward, I vowed to use every tool I had at my disposal, every skill, every observation, every ounce of knowledge, to ensure justice was not only served but undeniable. I could no longer sit quietly, invisible, dismissed. The time to act had arrived. The courtroom was a different world entirely, a stage where every word carried weight and every gesture was scrutinized. I had watched many trials in my career, but this one hit closer to home than any case I had ever handled. Anna's ex-husband seemed to thrive in that environment. His confidence was palpable, almost tangible, and the way he presented himself was a masterclass in arrogance. He didn't just attack Anna with words. He wielded influence. He brought in a team of high-powered attorneys whose only goal seemed to be to crush her credibility. Every document they filed, every piece of evidence they presented, was designed to make her look unstable, incapable, and financially irresponsible. The courtroom felt like a battlefield where she had been sent in unarmed. And yet, while he smiled and delivered his rehearsed lines, I sat quietly, analyzing, calculating, watching the cracks form in the story he was trying to build. There were moments when he mispronounced a figure, hesitated before answering a question, or offered just a little too much explanation. Subtle, almost imperceptible mistakes. Most people wouldn't notice, but I did. Meanwhile, my family remained on the sidelines, whispering their commentary as if they were spectators rather than participants. They nodded along when he claimed to have proof of Anna's supposed financial mismanagement. They seemed almost relieved when the court accepted documents that, to the trained eye, were riddled with inconsistencies. That it was infuriating, watching them believe him so completely. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, a combination of anger and resolve. I had to remind myself to stay calm. My plan wasn't to argue blindly or lash out. My plan was to wait, to observe, to gather the evidence that would turn the tables in a way no one would see coming. Day after day, he escalated his attacks. Where a week earlier he had relied on casual intimidation, now he presented falsified bank statements, exaggerated reports, and carefully constructed narratives designed to undermine every word Anna said. The judge's patience was apparent, but the tension in the courtroom grew with each passing session. I could see Anna struggling to maintain her composure, her hope dimming slightly as the courtroom seemed to tilt in his favor. And that was exactly the point. He thrived on control, and he wanted everyone, Anna, the judge, even our family, to feel powerless. But I wasn't powerless. I had been waiting for the moment when his overconfidence would expose him. Each misstep he made, each exaggerated claim, each piece of evidence that looked too perfect. These were the breadcrumbs I needed. My background in financial fraud gave me an instinct for the subtle signals of manipulation, and I knew I had found exactly what I needed to plan our counterattack. I watched, patient, as he presented a particularly damning report one morning. The numbers seemed plausible at first glance, but something felt off. The dates didn't align, the signatures were too uniform, and there was a trace of digital tampering that only someone with experience in fraud could spot. My pulse quickened as I realized the opportunity this presented. Every additional step he took to intimidate or manipulate was simply giving me more leverage. I didn't react outwardly, because reacting would have revealed my hand too soon. But inside, a strategy was forming, a plan that would expose every lie, every fabrication, and every attempt to dominate the narrative. By the time the session ended that day, I had quietly compiled a mental map of his methods, noting patterns in his fabrications, the timing of his manipulations, and the small but significant errors that no one else seemed to notice. This was the stage being set for his eventual undoing, and it felt satisfying, even in its subtlety, to know that his arrogance was sowing the seeds of his own downfall. Anna looked at me as we left the courtroom that day, worry etched across her face. I squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "Don't worry. I see it all. He can't hide from the truth." She nodded, trusting me in a way that no one else did. And that trust, fragile yet unshakable, would become the cornerstone of the plan that would finally deliver justice. The breaking point didn't come with fanfare. It came quietly, like the sudden snap of a rope that has been fraying under constant tension. Up until that day, I had maintained a careful balance, observing, calculating, waiting for the right moment to act. But that balance shattered during a mid-morning hearing. When his latest move crossed a line I could no longer ignore. He presented what he claimed were official financial statements, alleging that Anna had mishandled funds meant for her daughter. The documents were printed on crisp, official-looking paper, complete with forged letterheads and signatures that almost, but not quite, matched the originals. The judge glanced at them, raising an eyebrow, but Anna had no words to refute them. She sat frozen, eyes wide, hands trembling on her lap. I watched her, the cold knot in my stomach tightening. I felt a surge of frustration, not for myself, but for her. This wasn't just an attack on Anna. It was a deliberate attempt to steal her life, to make her doubt herself, to make her feel as powerless as the rest of the room wanted her to feel. Oh, at that moment, the courtroom seemed to close in around me. Every smirk from him, every approving nod from my family, every whisper of "See, she can't manage her life" from the spectators. It was as if the weight of all their disbelief and underestimation pressed down on my chest. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to breathe steadily. I had trained for high-pressure situations, but this wasn't about training. This was about protecting someone I loved from a man who had convinced everyone, even our family, that he held all the power. And yet, as I examined the documents carefully, I noticed something subtle, a pattern, a tiny inconsistency that spoke louder than any argument. The numbers didn't add up. The dates were slightly off. The signatures, while expertly forged, had telltale digital traces that only someone trained in financial investigations could recognize. It was then I realized the last straw had fallen. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This wasn't just about money or custody. This was about exposure, about justice, and about ensuring that Anna's daughter would grow up safe, protected, and free from the shadow of manipulation. My decision crystallized in that instant. I would no longer remain in the shadows. I could no longer be the quiet observer. It was time to act. Later that evening, I sat with Anna in the living room. Her daughter was asleep upstairs, oblivious to the tension that had filled the courtroom like a storm cloud. Anna's hands shook as she poured herself a cup of tea, trying to calm herself. I could see the fear, the self-doubt, and the exhaustion etched into her features. I told her quietly, "I see it all. Every lie, every manipulation. And I know exactly what needs to happen." Her eyes widened. "But how? He has lawyers, connections. He'll bury us before we even get a chance." I took her hands in mine. "He may have power, but he doesn't have the truth. And that is something no amount of money can fabricate. Trust me, I've seen people like him before, and they always make the same mistake. They underestimate the person they're trying to crush." For the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. She didn't know all the details, but she understood that we now had a plan. That night, I started piecing together the puzzle, reviewing every document, every email, every report he had submitted. I realized that the very skills that had kept me quiet for so long, my analytical mind, my training in fraud investigations, my ability to see patterns others missed, were now the tools we would use to turn the tide. The breaking point wasn't just about his actions in court. It was about the realization that silence was no longer an option. If I wanted Anna and her daughter to have a future, I had to step out of the shadows. I had to use every ounce of knowledge, every piece of evidence I could uncover, and every strategic advantage I had. By the end of that night, the path forward was clear. I would not allow him to manipulate, intimidate, or control any longer. Justice was no longer a distant concept. It was a plan, carefully crafted, and it was mine to execute. Asterisk: when I tell people I work in investigations, their minds usually jump to dramatic raids and midnight arrests. The truth is quieter and far more surgical. My work has always been about patterns, the little things most people dismiss, and about turning those patterns into proof. It's the kind of work that makes you patient, precise, and a little addicted to detail. That tendency, that training, became our unique weapon. The night after the breaking point, I didn't sleep much. Anna's house was still warm from the day's company. A lamp hummed softly in the living room, and somewhere upstairs Anna's daughter breathed lightly in sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the stack of documents his team had filed, the ones that had nearly broken her in court. Copies of bank statements, unusually neat ledgers, supposedly official correspondence. On the surface they were immaculate. That was the problem. Fraud rarely looks messy. It looks too perfect. I started the way I always do, by setting aside the stories and looking at the raw material. Numbers, formats, metadata. The first thing I noticed was the dates. They were careful, but they didn't align with the bank's own posting schedule. Small errors, easily missed by anyone without experience reviewing transactional records, but glaring if you knew what to look for. Then there were the signatures, not identically forged, but showing the same micro-hesitations in the loops and tails. To a casual observer that might read as consistent, to me it read as manufactured. My chest tightened. I had the kind of clarity in that moment that only comes from practice. This man had crafted a paper fortress, and he believed it was impenetrable because the paper looked official. But paper leaves traces. Digital documents have fingerprints, fonts, metadata tags, creation timestamps, and subtle file properties all betray their origins. That's where I lived professionally, in the small, stubborn details that refuse to lie. I called Anna's lawyer the next morning and asked him to meet me at the courthouse before the next hearing. He was a practical man, efficient and a little weary of courtroom theatrics. When I handed him the stack and began pointing to the inconsistencies, I watched his professional skepticism shift into careful attention. He asked for clarification about the things a judge would notice. I gave him avenues, motion language, requests to compel authentic originals from banks and custodians, and the specific questions that would force the opposing counsel to prove the provenance of their documents rather than letting the judge assume authenticity. This was important. The weapon couldn't be some off-the-record raid or an illegal pull of data. Everything we did had to be defensible in court. I couldn't, ethically or legally, use my agency's powers to bully the process. What I could do, what I had to do, was use what I knew to show the lawyer how to build a chain of custody that would reveal the fraud. My expertise was the blueprint. The lawyer's authority in court would be the tool that executed it. Over the next few days, we moved with deliberate steps. The lawyer filed a motion demanding certified originals of the bank statements and logs, and insisted on forensic copies from the office where some of the disputed documents had been produced. That forced the brother-in-law's team to either produce the originals under oath or explain why they couldn't, and excuses do not survive scrutiny for long. I spent hours with copies of the documents, running examinations the way I would on a case file. I examined PDF metadata, creation and modification timestamps, application names used to save the documents, even the language settings. I compared font kerning and spacing, the subtle irregularities that proprietary PDF converters sometimes introduce, and that consistent forgers rarely catch. On one file, I found a telltale digital breadcrumb. The document had been converted from a different file type. on a specific date more recent than the date it purported to originate. That alone would have been suspicious. Layer onto that the slightly off-date formats, day and month reversed, inconsistently, and a pattern emerged. But the real breakthrough came when I traced a small payment that had been used to justify one of the transfers. It wasn't a large sum, nothing to make anyone blink in a financial audit, but it connected to a shell entity that didn't exist on any legitimate ledger. The shell's email footprints linked back through a mundane trail of invoices and vendor correspondences to an address registered to a company his business associate nominally owned. In other words, a paper trail that had been deliberately constructed to funnel money and create the illusion of a legitimate expense. That's classic white-collar maneuvering. It's the sort of thing I'd pursued in my professional life dozens of times, but never under my family's roof. I documented everything meticulously. Screenshots, hashes of files, a timeline of conversions, and a map of transactions. I wrote clear notes on what needed to be subpoenaed and why. Then, for the first time since I had kept my career a secret, I leaned across the lawyer's desk and said the words I had rehearsed in the shadows. If you let me, I can testify to these findings. I can walk the court through why these documents are forgeries and trace the money trail. That proves it. His eyes widened, and I could see a calculation happen. A trained attorney's mind mapping the credibility boost that an expert witness could provide. He asked the question I expected. Would I be willing to be sworn in? And I said yes. I would be careful. I would not misuse my title. I would not short-circuit the legal process. But I could, as an expert witness, bridge the gap between complex technical evidence and a judge who needed plain, undeniable proof. There was one more decision to make. How public do we go with the plan? I advised the lawyer to hold most of it close, to file targeted motions rather than broad accusations. For him, every filing must be strategic. For me, every disclosure could compromise a method. We chose a path that used the judicial process to expose the fraud without theatrics. Compel the originals, force forensic copies, demand production of emails and server logs tied to the documents, and request an evidentiary hearing where I could explain the discrepancies under oath. I also made a personal decision. I would not volunteer my agency's institutional authority. I would stand as an expert because of my training and experience, not because of a badge. That distinction mattered. It protected the integrity of the process and prevented a scenario where the defense could attack the evidence as the work of a secretive government agent trying to strong-arm a private matter. Instead, I would be the calm, credible voice of experience who walked the court through why these documents could not be trusted. As the days ahead filled with motions and subpoenas, anxiety and adrenaline alternated in equal measure. There were late-night calls with the lawyer as he crafted precise language to request the production of server logs and original bank statements. There were careful conversations with Anna about pacing. She needed to be ready, emotionally steady, and prepared to stand firm in her testimony. There were also moments when I checked myself, reminding myself that this was not my agency's case to prosecute. I would not cross lines. My weapon was my mind, my training, and my meticulous record keeping. And those, used properly, were powerful. The plan was simple in theory but intricate in practice. Use the legal tools to force the production of authentic records. Introduce my forensic analysis in a way that a judge could follow, and let the inconsistencies speak louder than any passionate plea. The goal wasn't theatrical exposure. It was an airtight demonstration. Show the chain of manipulation, expose the shell entities, and the fabricated documents. and prove that the narrative he had built was a construction, not a truth. I remember, in the stillness of the night before we executed the motion, being flooded with a quiet sense of resolve. This was no longer about proving anything to my parents. It was not about their whispered judgments. It was about ensuring Anna's daughter had a stable life, and that a man who used money as a weapon could not turn the law into another tool of harm. My unique weapon, the narrow, obsessive knowledge of how paper betrays a lie, felt like a scalpel in my hand. It was time to use it. When the hearing date arrived, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in months. The plan was born, assembled from long nights of analysis and careful legal choreography. It was not glamorous. It was not fast. It was deliberate, and that deliberateness was its strength. Justice, I had learned, often moves slowly, but when it moves with evidence and precision, it is unstoppable. The morning of the hearing, I felt a strange calm settle over me. After weeks of careful preparation, sleepless nights spent combing through documents, tracing digital breadcrumbs, and mapping the patterns of deception, it was time to see the plan in action. I arrived early at the courthouse, clutching my folder of meticulously organized evidence. Every page, screenshot, and timeline note in precise order. Anna sat beside me, anxious yet trusting, her hand occasionally brushing mine. Her small gestures reminded me why I had committed so fully to this fight. The courtroom felt unusually still that day. Even the air seemed to tense, as if it knew something was about to break. The judge presided with quiet authority, eyes scanning the assembled lawyers. My sister's ex-husband lounged with his usual arrogance, probably confident that his expensive team and polished lies would carry the day. He had no idea the tide was about to turn. The lawyer called me to the stand, introducing me as an expert in financial document analysis and fraud detection. My heart pounded, but I forced a steady, calm voice. I began with the basics: how legitimate financial statements should look, the types of errors that naturally occur, and how professional forgeries often leave subtle but detectable traces. I made sure every point was simple enough for the judge to follow, yet precise enough to show my expertise. Then I began presenting the evidence. Step by step, I walked the court through the documents he had submitted. I highlighted the inconsistent dates, the irregular formatting, the micro-patterns in the signatures that indicated forgery. I showed how certain numbers had been manipulated to appear legitimate, tracing them back to a shell entity that had no legitimate existence. I explained the digital breadcrumbs, timestamps, metadata, and conversion histories that proved the documents had been altered long after the dates they claimed to originate from. I could see the subtle shifts in the courtroom as I spoke. The smug smile on his face faltered. His lawyers exchanged quick, worried glances. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing in concentration. My words were not dramatic or theatrical. They were precise, undeniable, and methodical. Every step I took dismantled the house of cards he had built. When I reached the section showing the trail of transactions that tied the fabricated documents to a shell company linked to him, I paused deliberately. "These aren't mistakes," I said quietly but firmly. "They are deliberate fabrications, and the paper trail proves that the intent was to mislead this court." I could see him shift in his seat. His carefully constructed confidence began to crumble. He opened his mouth, probably to interrupt, but the judge's sharp gaze silenced him. There was no room for argument against the evidence itself. It stood on its own, unassailable. The lawyer then submitted additional forensic copies, which corroborated everything I had presented. Each piece of evidence reinforced the next, creating a chain so clear that any attempt to deny it would appear absurd. By the time I finished, The courtroom was quiet, the weight of what had just been presented settling over everyone. For the first time, I felt a flicker of victory, not the triumph of arrogance or ego, but the satisfaction that truth, when methodically uncovered, could prevail against manipulation. Anna squeezed my hand again, a silent acknowledgement that the first step toward justice had been achieved. The tide had shifted. The foundation he thought unshakable was cracking beneath him, and I knew that the next moments would be the most critical. The confrontation and the ultimate downfall of someone who had spent so long believing he could control everyone around him. The moment it happened, I felt almost a sense of inevitability. After weeks of careful observation, preparation, and execution, the moment of reckoning had arrived. I watched as the man who had spent months manipulating, intimidating, and lying was forced to confront the reality he had tried so hard to obscure. It started with the judge addressing him directly, her tone crisp and deliberate. "These documents," she said, tapping the stack I had meticulously prepared, "contain multiple inconsistencies and evidence of intentional forgery. You are required to explain their provenance under oath." I saw it immediately. His eyes widen, a micro-expression of panic passing across his face. Before he could attempt to mask it with arrogance, his mouth opened, closed, opened again. The rehearsed lines he had depended on for so long were useless here. Every lawyer in the room shifted in their seats, some murmuring to each other, because they realized that the strategy they had relied upon was crumbling under the weight of concrete evidence. I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the calm clarity I had learned to cultivate over years in investigations. This wasn't about enjoying his fear. It was about observing, noting, and ensuring that the evidence spoke for itself. I stayed seated, keeping my focus on the facts I had presented, letting them carry the moment. He tried to argue, stammering over explanations that made less sense the longer he spoke. He claimed the documents were legitimate, that there had been accounting errors, that someone else must have been responsible for discrepancies. But each claim was dismantled, methodically, as the lawyer presented corroborating evidence from multiple sources, certified originals from banks, server logs proving document creation dates, and an expert testimony that left no room for doubt. I saw the shift in his demeanor, the confident arrogance replaced by frantic desperation. He realized that his control over the narrative had evaporated. All the money, all the lawyers, all the polished presentations, none of it mattered when confronted with irrefutable proof. His voice began to falter, and I could hear the frustration creeping in, sharp and raw. For the first time, he was powerless, and then the ultimate moment of confrontation arrived. The judge asked directly about the shell company I had traced, about the transactions that had been fabricated, and about the digital inconsistencies that proved deliberate forgery. He froze. Every word I had spoken, every piece of evidence I had prepared, converged into a single, undeniable conclusion. He had been caught. His legal team attempted to interject, to salvage the situation, but the court was no longer playing his game. The judge's eyes were sharp, her tone unwavering. The Fawade he had relied on for so long, the Fawade of control, influence, and invincibility, collapsed completely. I watched him slump in his seat, the smirk wiped from his face, replaced by disbelief and rage. He had expected to dominate, to manipulate, to convince the court that Anna was incapable. Instead, he had been outmaneuvered at every turn by a combination of legal strategy and meticulous forensic evidence. I caught Anna's gaze across the room. Relief and quiet joy danced in her eyes. She understood without words that the battle had turned irrevocably in our favor. I gave her a small, reassuring nod, keeping my voice calm when speaking to the court. This was not my victory to boast about. It was truth manifesting itself in a way even the most cynical observer could not deny. By the end of the hearing, the verdict was clear. The fabricated documents were invalid. The attempts to discredit Anna were dismissed, and the credibility of her ex-husband and his legal team had been irreparably damaged. He left the courtroom that day stunned, his carefully constructed persona shattered. He had been powerful in appearance only. The truth had stripped him bare, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. It was a moment of pure justice. Not theatrical, not vengeful, but perfect in its inevitability. Arrogance, manipulation, and deceit cannot survive when confronted with careful, deliberate truth, and that truth had been delivered with precision, patience, and unwavering commitment. The final payoff wasn't loud. It didn't involve dramatic gestures or angry accusations. Instead, it was the quiet, undeniable moment when the truth had fully asserted itself, leaving him with nothing to hide behind. A week after the courtroom hearing, I received the call from Anna's lawyer confirming that the judge had not only dismissed all the claims based on falsified documents but had also sanctioned her ex-husband for submitting fraudulent evidence. The decision was clear and firm. Custody would remain with Anna, and her daughter's stability was secured. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, Anna's daughter coloring quietly on a piece of paper nearby, and letting the weight of that moment sink in. The relief in Anna's eyes was unmistakable. A mix of disbelief, gratitude, and quiet triumph. She finally allowed herself to exhale, to release the tension that had gripped her for months. I squeezed her hand gently, silently acknowledging that we had crossed the finish line. The most satisfying part wasn't the legal victory itself, though it was monumental, but the way it had unfolded. Every detail of his own arrogance had led to his undoing. The very documents he thought would secure his control had exposed him. The shell company he believed would obscure his trail had highlighted his deception. The careful lies, intended to intimidate and manipulate, had been laid bare by meticulous observation and precision. In other words, the universe had a way of ensuring that his downfall was not just fair, but poetic. Every move he had made to dominate and humiliate was now evidence of his own undoing. He had been defeated by his own overconfidence, by the tools he had relied on so heavily to assert control. Later, Anna and I sat down together in a quiet corner of the house, reflecting on everything that had happened. She was exhausted but smiling, the kind of deep, genuine smile that comes after fear has finally been replaced by certainty. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "After everything, he actually lost. He didn't see it coming at all." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. He didn't. And that's exactly how it should be. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about balance. And sometimes, balance just happens to be perfect poetic justice. We didn't need to gloat. We didn't need dramatic celebrations. The payoff was already complete in the certainty of her victory, in the restored safety of her child, and in the knowledge that truth had prevailed over deceit. The ex-husband's power, so carefully cultivated and flaunted, had evaporated completely, leaving him exposed and powerless in the light of facts and accountability. For me, there was also a quiet personal vindication. My family had labeled me a failure for years, blind to the work I did, blind to the skills I possessed. Now, they could see, not through words or bragging, but through undeniable results, that I had orchestrated a victory that even the most seasoned manipulation could not resist. The quiet competence they had ignored for so long had proven itself in the most satisfying way possible. That night, As I closed the folders of evidence and turned off my desk lamp, I allowed myself a rare moment of calm. Anna and her daughter were upstairs, safe and sleeping, unaware of the exact measures taken to secure their future, but thriving because of them. And I, the failure of the family in their eyes, had been the very thing that ensured justice was done. It was a payoff both practical and poetic. A quiet, perfect, deeply satisfying justice that could not be reversed, denied, or diminished. The weeks after the courtroom battle felt almost surreal. The tension that had haunted every interaction, every family gathering, every whispered conversation, gradually eased into a calm I hadn't felt in months. Anna's ex-husband, once a looming presence in our lives, had retreated. His carefully constructed image shattered. He was no longer a threat, not legally, not emotionally, and not socially. Justice had not only been served, but it had been undeniable, permanent, and fitting to the very core of his arrogance. Anna began to rebuild her life with a sense of certainty and confidence I hadn't seen in her since before the marriage. Her daughter's laughter returned to the house, bright and uninterrupted, no longer overshadowed by fear or tension. It was a simple thing, really, a child sleeping through the night, a mother smiling without anxiety. But in that simplicity lay the profound impact of what had been accomplished. As for me, the victory was more than professional validation. It was personal affirmation. My family, who had dismissed my accomplishments for years, could no longer deny my abilities. They saw, quietly and reluctantly, that the quiet one had orchestrated the unraveling of a sophisticated scheme that had threatened someone I loved. Their whispers of judgment and disbelief were replaced by a cautious respect, not dramatic praise, but acknowledgement that my skills, patience, and intelligence had mattered in a profound and tangible way. Life settled into a new rhythm. I returned to my work, balancing investigations with family visits, carrying the knowledge that justice is often slow but always precise. When guided by careful observation, Anna, once uncertain and fearful, found her stride as a mother and a woman in control of her own narrative. Her daughter grew surrounded by safety, laughter, and love, the simple, unshakable pillars that no deceit or manipulation could dismantle. And the man who had tried to dominate us, he existed in the aftermath only as a cautionary tale. His arrogance had been exposed for all to see. The fraudulent documents he relied upon became a symbol of how hubris, greed, and cruelty can backfire. He had lost everything he sought to manipulate, and his power, once flaunted so openly, had been replaced by the quiet shame of defeat. For me, the moral was clear. Justice is rarely instantaneous, but it is inevitable when guided by diligence, intelligence, and patience. The very qualities that others overlooked. My calm, my quiet, my attention to detail, became the instruments of resolution. And in that realization, I found a sense of satisfaction far beyond mere victory. It was the knowledge that truth, observed and applied with precision, cannot be denied. I often reflect on that time, on how the careful gathering of evidence, the meticulous attention to detail, and the unwavering commitment to doing the right thing changed the course of so many lives. Anna and her daughter live in peace now, untouched by the shadows that once threatened them. My family has learned, quietly, the value of seeing beyond appearances, and I carry forward the reminder that those who underestimate patience, skill, and integrity often do so at their own peril. The world returned to its rhythm, but for those of us who experienced that battle, life was quietly transformed. The line had been crossed, the plan executed, the justice served, and the new normal, calm yet unshakable, had finally arrived. Asterisk, don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.